The 14th of July this year is the 5th anniversary of a landmark deal between extreme opposites. The Iran nuclear deal, or JCPOA that is, or whatever is left of it. Sabotage began with this country's nuclear program and is now lashing out at the very deal that was to limit that nuclear program in return for lifting nuclear-related economic UN sanctions off Iran. The 2nd of July saw a fire at Natanz nuclear site destroy a centrifuge assembly center. This followed a string of suspicious fires and explosions across the country. Foreign hands may have been at work here days before the JCPOA anniversary and months before the lifting of a UN arms embargo against Iran by way of the JCPOA. In what state is that deal today? And who would sabotage an internationally accepted deal of such scale, and why? Stay with me, Leila Faramarzi, on Iran Today for answers. Iran has not announced culprits, but the New York Times, citing a Middle Eastern intelligence official, reported that it was a bomb planted by Israel that exploded Natanz centrifuge site. It wouldn't be the first attempt on Natanz by Israel and the US. But if they're so against Iran's nuclear program, why sabotage a deal meant to limit that very program? Mr. Dehqani Firuzabadi responds. He is a lifelong politician who received us at his office on the presidential grounds.
همین آمریکا در زمان جنگ از صدام حمایت کرد.
The US supported Saddam Hussein in his war on Iran, a totally erroneous policy. Later the US had to remove Saddam. The Americans supported Daesh, even going as far as creating it, but that policy backfired on them and caused them harm, and so the Americans were forced to step back. We see their withdrawal from the JCPOA as another erroneous policy, just like the American support for the Saudi government for its invasion of Yemen, or its policy of targeting Syrian sovereignty. The US is pursuing wrong policies in this region. The Islamic Republic's logic is consistent with international law.
The JCPOA can mean different things to different people. Mr. Tajik made a mention of that deal's overall significance, or rather the present state it is in. The former ambassador came to our studios to share his thoughts.
The JCPOA symbolized our international approach vis-à-vis international norms. Naturally, our regional rivals would not tolerate such an approach. These rivals may be the Zionist regime or Saudi Arabia. In fact, when the Islamic Republic decided that we have to adopt this approach, it showed its adaptability to global political issues.
Mr. Jamali Nobandagani is a former MP and member of the Parliamentary National Security Committee. Let's hear him out.
I think that we should not limit the JCPOA to the past 5 years. Everything started in 2003 when Mr. Khatami was president. We started talks with the E3, Britain, France and Germany, leading to the Sadabad Declaration. Therefore, the JCPOA has a precedent. But after Mr. Rouhani took office, there was a speculation in the country that we had better engage the Americans in talks, because even the Europeans said that the US might debunk any agreement reached between Iran and Europe. Of course, the leaders said from the very beginning that they may not keep their promises. But in order to remove any doubt among Iranian officials and people about the efficacy of talks, negotiations started 5 years ago and continued for 2 years, leading to the JCPOA.
It wouldn't be the first time Trump's US violates an international convention or resolution. But Iranian ambassador to the UN, Majid Takht-Ravanchi, observed with regard to the US's violating this UN resolution, it is unprecedented in the history of the United Nations that a permanent member of the UN Security Council, which has passed the resolution, violates the resolution itself, and also encourages other countries to violate it. Such a trend paints a blurry future for international relations as a notion.
آمریکا پیمان اقتصادی
The US revised its own economic treaties with China and with many other nations. The US was seeking to change everything in its own interests, while international agreements should take into account the interests of all parties involved. The US also pulled out of the Paris climate deal. It recently officially quit the World Health Organization. That demonstrates that the US policy of quitting treaties and following unilateralism in international politics, economy and security will eventually backfire. Independent nations like Iran will remain immune because they would adopt their own policy in international relations based on their own capabilities.
The US officially pulled out of the JCPOA on 8th May 2018, reimposing and reinforcing all UN sanctions as now US sanctions on Iran. If this and perhaps lethal sabotage were intended to intimidate the West Asian country into signing a second nuclear deal, it is irony made manifest. Since the US pullout, Iran has been scaling back its commitments to the deal, reversibly of course, in stages. This has been to get Western European parties to the JCPOA to deliver on the promised economic dividends of the deal for Iran. But more on that after a little on the detail and effort put into the deal. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, or Iran nuclear deal, is detailed in 159 pages and 5 annexes. The agreement was reached by Iran and the 5 permanent UN Security Council members plus Germany, called the P5+1, on July 14, 2015. The P5+1 are China, Russia, France, the United Kingdom and the United States, plus Germany. After being endorsed by UN Security Council Resolution 2231, the nuclear deal was adopted on July the 20th, 2015. The deal did next become operational in 2016. But Donald Trump took office as US President in 2017, and before the deal could actually take off, it lost its westernmost party, the US, in 2018. The deal laid out a process spanning over 15 to 25 years, and that was to be supervised by an 8-member committee, Iran, the P5+1, and the European Union. Iran insists on remaining on its path to advancement as an independence-seeking country. It remains focused. But should it acknowledge there have been foreign hands at play behind the killings and explosions? Well, it has been known to retaliate in the past. And Israeli media affiliated to their government have themselves hinted at Israeli hands at work here in Iran. This country even presented the February 1996 disarmament conference with a draft treaty and demanded adoption of a nuclear test ban treaty. It was an unprecedented move coming from a non-aligned movement country and sped up talks to prohibit nuclear tests.
From the very beginning, the Islamic Republic of Iran was not seeking to develop nuclear weapons. Iran has never sought to use nuclear energy for military purposes. The US and Israel spread falsehoods in the world in this regard as they launched psychological warfare against the Islamic Republic of Iran. They spread Iranophobia and depict Iran as a terrorist state while they themselves symbolize terrorism, or they raise the issue of human rights here and there. For years they were trying to overthrow the Islamic Republic, but after they failed, they resorted to these methods to depict Iran as a threat to the international community. But the fact, of course, is otherwise. By signing the JCPOA, the Islamic Republic of Iran denied them of this pretext.
But in spite of all said and done, Iran was under scrutiny. Israel, for one, is ever active in pushing for inspections of Iran's nuclear facilities. Israel, which is not an NPT or Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty signatory and is estimated to have 80 to 90 nuclear warheads and enough fissile material for a total of 200 nuclear warheads. Israel, which is constantly in breach of UN resolutions with its unauthorized expansion and humanitarian crimes against Palestinians.
In recent years, the IAEA has exercised the widest and unprecedented inspection of Iranian nuclear activities. For instance, in 2019, more than 300 inspections were conducted, 30 cases of which were snap inspections. Iran had not declared any nuclear activity in those 30 places, but it had cooperated with the IAEA, whose inspectors were willing to visit. The IAEA visited any suspected site, and as its Director General's reports show, no negative point was seen. Just recently, the IAEA demanded access to 2 sites, but Iran refused, on the grounds that this agency had not presented any documented evidence and had only relied on allegations of the enemies of Iran. If Iran agrees to such unreasonable demands, the IAEA inspectors would regularly demand access to everywhere they want. Therefore, this trend has to stop somewhere.
Anyhow, Iran showed goodwill by signing the JCPOA and welcoming UN nuclear watchdog inspectors. The nuclear watchdog, or IAEA, even confirmed 15 times or so Iran's full compliance with the nuclear deal. Iran received no reward for its compliance, however, and after seeing itself forced into a reversal of its commitments, it is being hounded for no longer welcoming inspectors with open arms. This is almost funny. The country is being pushed to the brink of pulling out of the JCPOA altogether, even leaving the NPT, and they're wondering why it no longer answers to the nuclear watchdog. Actually, even now, Iran is not in total non-compliance with the IAEA. But if not under the cover of nuclear inspection, how else might spies have leaked enough information out for so much dangerous sabotage, from cyber attacks to the assassination of nuclear scientists, perhaps even to explosions? For the past 2 decades, the IAEA has kept its closest watch on Iran. Time for a short break. We'll be back in no time. Four Iranian nuclear scientists were assassinated between 2010 and 2012 by car and motorcycle bombs and shooting. Another was wounded in an attempted murder. In 2011 and 2012, Iranian authorities arrested a number of Iranians who allegedly carried out the assassination campaign on behalf of Mossad, the Israeli intelligence service. Israeli complicity was reportedly confirmed by Western intelligence services and US officials.
اولین تروری که انجام دادن شهید دکتر علی محمدی بود.
They first assassinated Masoud Ali Mohammadi, who was gunned down in front of his home. The assassin said in televised confessions that he had traveled to Israel and all ways leading to Ali Mohammadi's residence had been simulated. Israeli agents had contacted the assassin in one of our neighboring countries. We had some other nuclear martyrs, but the martyr who was key to Iran's ability in enriching uranium to 20% purity was Dr. Shahriari. Western media initially imagined that the Islamic Republic was bluffing, but after they saw Iran's ability, they assassinated him. But Iran's ability to enrich uranium to 20% purity brought Western powers to serious negotiations with Iran.
As for cyber attacks, the first major cyber attack against Iran's nuclear program was made in 2010 by Israel and the US, using what's known as Stuxnet. The attack damaged centrifuge rotors through 2 different routines.
باز هم احتمال زیاد
Although it is not yet certain and nothing has been announced officially by the Islamic Republic, I personally think that some sort of cyber infiltration might have been done through companies repairing centrifuges, as it was the case with the Stuxnet virus. They have software to hack systems. They are able to impose commands other than the users in a bid to mislead the system to act against itself.
We'll be continuing with Iran's JCPOA commitments after a quick break with Shahrzad for a look into other media outlets.
Hi, I'm Shahrzad Manicherry, and this is the news section of Iran Today. We'll be looking online for the latest update on the 5th anniversary of the signing of the JCPOA and Iran's stance towards the US's maximum pressure campaign. In an article by Tehran Times, we see Pompeo has vowed to annihilate all of Iran's JCPOA benefits, says former French envoy. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has vowed to annihilate all the benefits that Iran could draw from the JCPOA, says a former French ambassador to Tehran. This is why, after the sanctions on practically all economic activities, he has pushed for sanctions on Iranian exports of uranium and heavy water authorized by the JCPOA, as well as on all the ongoing nuclear cooperation between Iran and the remaining participants, even if they were clearly useful for limiting different risks of proliferation, Francois Nicolas said in an interview with the Tehran Times. And now he is trying to restore the arms embargo imposed by the United Nations and lifted in 2015 by the Security Council in the wake of the conclusion of the JCPOA, Nicolas adds. Alba Waba reports Iran makes first ever overhaul of Bushehr nuclear plant, reconnects it to the national grid. Iranian experts have carried out overhaul and maintenance work on Bushehr nuclear plant for the first time and reconnected it to the national grid, the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran said. For the first time, the annual fuel change and periodic repairs of the main equipment at Bushehr nuclear power plant were carried out by the capable specialists of this advanced nuclear power plant, and the power plant was reconnected to the national electricity grid after successful tests, AEOI said. Within the summertime peak consumption period just beginning, the plant successfully resumed electricity generation on Sunday and hooked up with the national electricity grid, it added. American News investigates how Iran to overcome difficulties via negotiations, but not with the U.S., says IRGC commander. Iran's IRGC Aerospace Force Brigadier General Amir Ali Hajizadeh said that Iran can overcome economic difficulties and the U.S. sanctions via holding talks, but not with the U.S. and enemies, but with Iranian knowledge-based firms and domestic universities. He noted that Iran has gained remarkable achievements under the sanctions, relying on its domestic capabilities and experts. Iran does not need the permission of the arrogant powers for developing its defense, health, and other sectors, Iranian officials say. They believe that Iran has seized the sanctions as an opportunity to improve its various sectors. Various knowledge-based companies and universities of the country are cooperating with each other to hit the said targets. That's all for this segment. We'll see you next week.
Iran has thus far remained steadfast, even in inching away from its JCPOA commitments. It is still waiting for European action to pedal back into full compliance with the deal, if it sees action from a Europe fearful of losing its US alliance. The two-way goods trade between the United States and the European Union was $807 billion in 2018.
Ever since the signature of the JCPOA, the Islamic Republic of Iran has stuck with two major strategies. One was to keep Trump in international isolation. Our diplomatic game was so effective that Trump even failed to convince his closest allies to leave the JCPOA and align Europe, China, and Russia with himself. Therefore, Trump's isolation was a positive point for us. Despite imposing unilateral sanctions upon Iran, Trump failed to build consensus against us. A parallel strategy was that we will remain committed to the JCPOA as long as it would benefit our country and people. I think that these two strategies have so far worked well.
Now, what have been the steps taken away from the JCPOA? The first step back was announced on May the 8th, 2019. That was the anniversary of the US pullout from the JCPOA a year back. Iran would no longer ship its excess low-enriched uranium and heavy water abroad, and it gave other states party to the deal 60 days to deliver on economic profit promised Iran by the deal, mostly in the oil and banking sectors. Should they fail, Iran would resume uranium enrichment beyond 3.67% and construction at Arak nuclear plant. Iran was not pulling out of what was to be a win-win deal, but was now offering a less-for-less deal. The heavy water, 32 tons of it, America was to buy after the JCPOA signing. It was in keeping with JCPOA demands. The US wanted it, but US Congress stopped it. More on the US sabotaging itself as well as others in a bit.
One point which was criticized by the leader was that we had fulfilled all our obligations together, reducing the purity of enrichment, shutting down some enrichment facilities like Arak reactor and the Natanz facility, and Ford on our part was not reciprocated by the other party. Sanctions had to be lifted. Foreign investment was supposed to flow in. Banking transactions had to resume. Our oil sales had to be expanded. At the beginning, there was some overture, but even under the Obama administration, our banks, ministries, individuals, and institutions were slapped with sanctions. But Obama's successor, Trump, did it on a larger scale.
Next announcement came in 60 days, on July the 6th. Iran would take the second step back by going beyond the 3.67% purity ceiling of uranium enrichment. It gave the remaining parties to the deal another 60 days, but still not satisfied with their compliance, on September the 5th it announced its third step. Iran would now begin developing and using more advanced centrifuges such as those it was assembling at Natanz. On November the 6th came the fourth step. Iran would begin gas injection into the Fordo centrifuges. The fifth and final step, also reversible, was announced in early January of 2020, 5th January. In reducing its commitments, Iran would discard the last key component of its operational limitations in the JCPOA. That would be the limit on the number of centrifuges. Hence, Iran's nuclear program no longer faces any operational restrictions, including enrichment capacity, percentage of enrichment, amount of enriched material, and research and development. I asked if the Natanz explosion and incidents of the kind might have set Iran back irreversibly. All answers were negative.
In terms of nuclear energy, Iranian scientists are involved in design, implementation, and operation. This industry is in the Iranians' minds and could not be destroyed by bombs and missiles. Obama had acknowledged in the IPAC meeting of Jewish leaders that the US wanted full removal of Iran's nuclear industry. But the fact is that this industry has been nationalized in Iran and is run by our own youth.
Behruz Kamalvandi, a spokesman for Iran's Atomic Energy Organization, said that the fire could slow down Iran's development and production of advanced centrifuges in the medium term, but that Iran would replace the damaged building with a bigger one with yet more advanced equipment. Iran has maintained all along that its nuclear program is for peaceful scientific purposes, for use in medical, agricultural, environmental, and industrial fields, say for supplying electricity or for the radiological protection of the environment. This is its legal right as an NPT signatory. Now, talking of direct US sabotage apart from engineering or co-engineering cyber attacks and more. In April 2016, just 100 days after JCPOA Implementation Day, Iran came to realize the US had no serious intention of releasing its frozen assets. The leader Ayatollah Khamenei said American leaders write that banks are to deal with Iran, but their scaremongering against Iran can only turn banks away from this country. Then there was the 32 tons of heavy water for use in nuclear reactors, which the US was to buy for $8,600,000 but didn't, because of a Congress vote in May 2016. That was okay by Iran.
The US is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. When an agreement like the JCPOA goes to the Security Council and becomes a resolution to become enforceable for every nation in the world, the JCPOA became binding for all countries. Then the US, which always claims to be working in favor of security and order in the world, abandons this international treaty in an illegal gesture. Such conduct by Trump would serve as lessons for the Islamic Republic and the entire world.
No matter which party comes to power, the strategy the Americans and the Europeans would adopt would not change significantly. I'm sure that even if Joe Biden becomes president, he will not return to JCPOA. Over the past 5 to 6 years, they stopped us. Now they may be willing to engage us in a new round of talks for a new treaty and try to engage other issues like regional affairs and our defense capabilities and win more and more concessions.
That'll be all on the tale of mid-2018, which I had promised we'd get back to. There's more to be said on Natanz and more, so do watch at the same times next week and each week after, and don't forget to leave your comments and topic requests. Bye for now.